I'm delighted to, in fact, here, because I've been with him a minute ago, I'm delighted to see his wife Fiona and daughter Beatrice in the audience, and we'll be presenting the award afterwards. Now, the person lecturing is somebody that I suspect most people in this room will know very well. Professor Kevin Fong, I think I might say you are now Prof, and that we've got a typo in the thing, so well done for that. Kevin, for some of his time, is a consultant anaesthetist at UCL hospitals. He does a number of other things. He's National Clinical Advisor to NHS England's Emergency Preparedness Team, relevance to his talk. He's also a pretty phenomenal, prolific TV presenter, and was close to being an astronaut. Maybe he'll say something about this talk, I don't know, but if he doesn't mention it, you should read The Guardian from about 3 days ago, I think, really. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Kevin Fong to the podium, and he's going to talk to us about lessons for the next pandemic.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that introduction. It's a great honour to give this lecture, particularly because I remember very vividly meeting Peter. In fact, it was the first day I also met Jerry. When I was a medical student, I had gone to have a look at the trauma team at Silverstone, it's 1995, and I thought, this is what anaesthetists do. I'll be an anaesthetist, I think. I'm going to explain my CV a little bit because it's relevant to this talk. For those of you who don't know, I do a lot of things by accident, basically. I started out life studying astrophysics by accident because the University College Applications Handbook is alphabetically arranged. And then I went to medical school by accident because I lived with medical students my second year, and one night we went to the pub and we talked about it and their careers and their lives and their hopes and their dreams. We came home and I watched them dribbling on each other, and I thought, how hard can it possibly be? So I went to med school. At the end of med school, I was doing my elective. I was very badly prepared, and so I decided the thing I wanted to do was to go back to my love of space exploration, and I wrote some letters to NASA. I want to say some, wrote a lot of letters to NASA. Proper Shawshank Redemption style, and also it was the early days of email, so I had a dial-up, modem in my house, and so I started spamming out emails, and NASA hadn't sorted out their spam filters. So I did try and explain to one of my teenage boys what a dial-up modem was. I think he was a bit sick in his mouth, but so all of those were by accident, and then the reason I tell you that is the thing that was on purpose was when I was at NASA, I remember thinking when I was in the coffee rooms with them, and I was with Medical Operations Group in Houston, that the conversations that they had were the same conversations we had in the NHS, which was, we do a thing where science, technology and risk to human life coincide, but people right at the top don't really quite understand what we do at the front op, and if it carries on like this, someone will get hurt. And I thought, if two utterly disparate organisations in opposite sides of the Atlantic can have the same conversation, then there must be something they can learn from one another. And out of that I thought, well, there must be a general theory, basically, of risky business. That's what physics does. It takes special theory, the special case, and then makes it the general case. And I thought that must be possible. So that's really what I spent the rest of my career doing, is looking around at other organisations for lessons I could bring back to medicine. And that finally brings me to one of my current jobs, where I accidentally started working for Air Ambulance Kent, Surrey, Sussex, who are here on the front with me. I went to embed with them about 10 years ago just to look at how pre-hospital systems work, and I accidentally applied for a job, and they couldn't get rid of me after that. So the interesting thing for me about all of this is, having gone around looking for lessons that we can bring back to medicine, the last 2 years watching the National Health Service become its own masterclass in how to manage a complex incident, and that's what this talk is all about. There's not very much trauma in this, I'm afraid, but there are some lessons for trauma. This is a very quick tutorial on complexity theory. It's a whole different branch of study, but basically we talk a lot about aviation and airlines in medicine, probably ill-advisedly. But this is how you think about it. In an aircraft, the sick bag is simple. The aircraft is complicated. You can decompose it into all its constituent components, and you understand what each one does. But the patterns of airflow, aircraft flow around an airport are complex. Okay, and complex has these properties, and it's why the SARS-CoV-2 virus has been able to do so much damage. And you've got to think about why that was possible, right? So the genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus is 30 kilobases, yeah? Yours is like 3 billion. 3 billion. It is like watching an American aircraft carrier agreement of 10 ships with an aircraft carrier in the middle of it get taken on by 1 million pedalos, and the pedalos winning. That's what happened. And the reason that it's able to do that is because complex systems have these properties. They have no single point of control. They have emergent features. They scale in a non-linear fashion, and they self-organize. And this makes it a very potent threat. This 30 kilo base item, it's not even alive, the virus isn't alive, took on world economies, killed north of 10 million people worldwide and counting now. Now, I'm going to take you through the implications of what happens if you've got a complex threat. So this whole talk is basically a paper I'm in the middle of writing. It's not easy to write, so talking about it helps me process it a bit. In complex systems, initial conditions are important. Okay, there were lots of initial conditions in the NHS that are important to how we took on COVID, but this basically is the one you should look at. This is our critical care beds capacity per capita compared to comparable economies. Okay, so we start from not a great position, and that's not the end of it. But the initial conditions are important, and our initial conditions aren't great. The next thing is exponential growth and non-linearity. Now, I know that all of you in the room understand what exponential growth is. You all get that. Only because it's close to Christmas, I'm going to do a Christmas quiz just to check. Okay, we're all going to play. I'm going to ask for some audience participation. I'm going to play Kev Fong's penny doubling game, all right? And this is what that game is. If I give you 1 penny, and I double that penny every second, so 1p becomes 2p and 2p becomes 4p, how long before you're a millionaire? Okay, that's what I'm asking you, okay? And so that question, just to be clear, is how long before that 1 penny has become 100 million pennies? And if you have trouble visualizing that, thankfully the Rockefeller Center did it for you a few years ago. That is a trench with 100 million pennies in it. It's about waist deep and it goes on for about 200 feet. So the question I'm asking, I'm going to go to the audience. I want you to think your answer in your head. When I point at you, I just want you to shout out whatever that period of time is in your head, okay? That's what we're going to do. So I just want you to think about how long that 1 penny takes to become that trench of pennies, okay? Elsa, go on. Go on. Spit it out. It's too complicated. That's exactly the point of the exercise. Give me a number. Neil, go on. Give me a number. Come on. No, that's not how we play the game. You've just got to shout it out. You lose. Okay, Paul.
67 minutes.
67 minutes, thank you, sir. 3 months. Up there, on the back, top row. Yeah, don't look around. Yes.
63 seconds.
63 seconds, yes, there. Yes. About 2 hours, okay. 26.6 seconds, all right? So 26, and here's the thing, right? We do not have an intuitive feel for exponential functions. The gentleman up there who's saying 67 seconds, going, 67 seconds, I was in the ballpark. Do you know, the difference between 26 seconds and 67 seconds is the difference between being a millionaire and a 72 quadrillionaire, okay? So the lesson here is 1, we do not have an intuitive feel for exponential functions. 2, if you're wrong small, you're wrong big. No one should feel bad about not knowing the answer to that question. You can't do it. It's not a sum that you can do in your head very easily. The fact that you can see that the order of magnitude is seconds, or at least tells you that you understand something about logarithmic mathematics, but it's not easy to do. And this is the first problem with COVID. We do not have a respect for the growth of an exponential function. And the problem is by and large, we are managed by people who are good at heuristic processing of these things. We all do it. On a scene, in the pre-hospital setting, you have your impression based upon your experience of what's about to happen. There is no experience base for this, and that's the problem. And that's why you need mathematical models. Now, they were much maligned during the instance, but even the mathematical modelers know that they don't work. In fact, the mantra of all the mathematical modeling teams was, all mathematical models are wrong, but some might be useful. They know that. They know that what they're doing is just an approximation of reality. You need them so that you can work out where you're headed, because as we've just shown, your gut feeling is probably going to be wrong. At the start of the pandemic, it was actually quite easy to model these things. We were using these SIR models, so you're susceptible, infected, or removed from the recovered and removed from the group, right? And when we were hearing early on this idea that you might let the virus pass through the population and all that crap, it was this idea that it was the type of infection that someone gets it, gets immune to it, and can't get it again. These are good models, they've worked, they've been around since the early 20th century, but as the pandemic became more complicated, they just weren't up to it. This is just a simple compartment model for those of you who are anaesthetists in the room. This is the same thing that you do for the context-dependent half-life and the compartment models. Relatively straightforward, the maths is probably sort of further maths A-level type maths, quite easy to do. The problem was that later on, we started introducing different variants, different susceptibilities, differential susceptibilities by population, different vaccinations, and then we needed a more accurate model. And at this point, I was very lucky, and I ran into an old group that I knew from Durham, who were a particle physics and astronomy group, who got really incensed by how crap our models were, and they built their own. And I got to embed with them and work with them. So this is part of what I got to do in the end. And we published this. This is the June model for pandemic modelling. June, after June Almeida, who is the woman who first discovered the first coronavirus through electron microscopy. I was a very bit player in this exercise. The people on this paper did almost all of the heavy lifting, and I provided just some insight into the questions we need to ask. It's a very clever model, and I'm just going to explain it, because this sort of helps you understand the scale of the problem. We built 3 layers. We built a population layer based upon census data. If you live in the UK, you filled in the 2011 census, you are in this model. So 4 digits of your postcode and your occupation as reported at the time and your age at the time. And what it does, it says, if you're this old, of this occupation, living in this 4-digit postcode, statistically you're most likely to work in one of these places. So if you say I'm a teacher and I live in SW93, then there's about 4 schools that you probably work at, and we assign you probabilistically to those schools. And if we know where you're going to work from your home address, we know statistically how you're getting that plane, train or automobile. And we build that model for 55 million people in England and Wales. We didn't do this for Scotland, because we were working for NHS England at the time. And then what you do is you compare that to ONS data to see if you actually built a real model of how people really move in the working week. And indeed we had, and the model compared very well. Now it turns out we're really quite boring, because basically either we're at work, or in the pub, or in the restaurant, and we're not many other places basically. The recreationally we don't go to, or the cinema was another one. You don't actually have to model that many core locations. We had about 16 core locations. School, university, pub, cinema, restaurants. That's it. There's not many other places that most people are. So you now have a model that can move 55 million people every hour to an appropriate location, and so then you know where every single one of those people is at any point in time to the nearest hour, and you know what rooms they're in. And if you know what rooms they're in, you know whether or not they're going to get infected. So the next thing you have to do is to build a disease function. So once you've got 2 people and you've moved them into the right room, and you know you have, because the ONS tells you have, you need to work out whether they get infected. And to do that, you build this disease model. Now, the reason I put that up there is just to make myself look good. I had mathematicians explain this to me. It's quite a simple expression, actually. I realise this is what mathematicians do. They basically write plain English statements in Greek and then say, I'm very clever. All this is a cumulative probability distribution function, which is to say that on the left is the probability you get infected, and on the right is an expression that says, if you're in a room with someone who is infected at this stage of their infection, with this infectivity, and you've got this intensity of contact, so different locations have different intensities of contact. So for example, a nursery has a higher intensity of contact than, say, an accountant's office. You would hope, right? And then the problem is, of course, some of those parameters are unknown. So you have to solve the unknown parameters, and what you then end up doing is basically doing what you did at GCSE, which is solve a simultaneous, you know, that X and Y simultaneous equation. So that's a simultaneous equation in 2 dimensions, find X and find Y with 2 equations. This one does it, but it just does it in 18 dimensions, which is this. So this is the team I work with on the left there. For me, the most impressive thing about all this is the team out of Durham. The guy in the middle of that photograph is Frank Krause. At the start, I said, when he wanted to do this, I said, I have to go back to a UK health security agency and explain to them what you're doing. I'm pretty sure it works, but how am I going to make them respect you? Because you're not disease modelers. How am I going to make them understand your pedigree? And he's German, and I can't do the German accent, but he said, you can tell them that I wrote the code that found the Higgs boson. I was like, okay, that So, I have never met any of them. We did all of this by MS Teams. I still don't know to this day how tall any of those people are. we did this on the TV in our kitchens. The model isn't hard, right? You move people around and then you throw a probability function at it to see whether or not those people get infected. The problem is you're doing it for 55 million people every hour, every day of the pandemic, as the pandemic goes forwards, and then you're comparing that to the data. And you get a lot of nonsense out of it. So you need a really big computer. That's the thing in the middle, that's Archer. That's the National High Performance Computing Centre. So that's the size of a Coke machine, that thing. And there's an entire room, like this size of room of them. And the cooling fans are so loud you have to put ear defenders to stand in the room with it. Inside each of those machines is a huge number of cores processing that would make even your sportiest laptop look like a ZX81. And they crunch the numbers, and you run the model over and over and over again, and that's what you see middle top there. All those bits of spaghetti coming across are us running the model. And you can see the coloured lines are close to reality, all the purple lines are nonsense, so you have to throw away the purple lines and keep the things that are close to reality. Top left, the black lines are data, and the coloured lines are what the model was spitting out. So we were trying to run the model and get closer and closer to reality, and that's how you do it. That's how you do it. And there is a clever bit of uncertainty modelling that you do that I don't think I'm going to talk about here, but to try and make it computable. At the start, we used to throw this thing on the computer, and it would take all night to run through, and we just, you can't do that. Fast-moving crisis, you can't do that. Oh, I am going to talk about this. So this is how you do it, right? So the point is, the thing is, it's very, very expensive to compute. And when I say that, I don't mean that in an abstract way. At one point, the provost of Durham University rang Frank House up and said, I'm really worried about the electricity bill you're incurring with this model. So what you do to make the thing tractable is you build a model of your model so that you can basically work out roughly where it should go. And then when you know roughly, it's sort of like that iteration thing. When you know roughly where you should be, then you feed it back to the real model and you start doing it. And that's what that slide's about. The model worked, is the important thing to say. We needed it and it worked. So black dots are the data, coloured dots are the plausible futures that we were creating. This is a model on the 23rd of September 2020, and you can see that we'd already spotted regionally where we were headed as we went forwards into the future. And we did it by region. So we didn't get such a good match on the Southwest. The Southwest was for some reason always hard to fit, but the rest of it we fit. And it's quite hard to do this, right? It's quite hard to get it right, not just temporally, not just by number of infections, but also regionally. We also could get it by age. We could get the 3 ONS bins were 18 to 64, 65 to 84, 85 to 99. We knew who was getting infected, we knew where they were getting infected, we knew how old they were, and we could fit the data. So this was one of the, at this point in the pandemic, this was one of the more accurate models. What did that tell us? And part of this is to explain to you why COVID was the way that we all experienced it. It was deeply uncertain, it was very hard to get a fix on, but there were no easy answers. The first thing that we explored was this idea that maybe you could infect a certain layer of the population and leave all the others unaffected, right? So you'll have heard that at the start. The idea that you might be able to let all the kids go to school, but lock all the elderly people away. And that's a reasonable theory because you would imagine there's not much mixing between those layers of age. An 80-year-old probably doesn't come into contact with a 5-year-old, so why not let the 5-year-old go to school? But you can run that on the model, and you can do it by seeding the infection in different age groups. So what you're seeing there is the infection seeded in different initial age groups, school children, the blue line, teenagers in the green line, young adults in the orange and the older people, I'm in the red line, Christ, in there. And what happens over time, what this is showing you is over time as you run the model, the whole thing converges on what is something that's slightly younger than the average age of the population in the UK, which is to say, it doesn't matter where you put this, it doesn't matter which age strata you put it in, everyone gets it eventually. Why is that the case? It's because of the mixing layers. So what you're seeing here is 4 different runs of the model with different parameters, but all converging on roughly the same solution, which is that if the model's running, the places where you catch it are 1 household, 2 company, so your office, or 3 school. And company and school used a flip-flop, but basically that's what we were finding. And so that's the other problem is everyone said let the kids go to school, but you can't do that. Because what happens is they go to school, they get it, and they come to the most potent mixing layer, which is their house, where you spend most of your time, you have your least precautions, you have your highest intensity contact, and you give it to the people in your house. Now, why is that a problem? Because people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have higher occupancy households and are more likely to have multi-generational households. That is what accounts for the differences, the asymmetry in the spread that we saw. So to control the thing, you don't really have many options but to shut down schools and shut down quite a lot of the office space, because you can't shut down the household with it. This plot here is showing you the asymmetry and who got it. Now, the thing about this is that we did not build in as a susceptibility factor your ethnicity. We recorded it because it's in the ONS data, but we didn't put that in as a susceptibility factor, and yet we still found asymmetries in who was getting it and who was dying from it. Why? Because it's your socioeconomic status that determines whether or not you're going to get infected and do badly, because it's such a powerful determinant of your health and your job. So people from lower socioeconomic strata are more likely to have people-facing jobs, and more likely to live in high occupancy households, or and more likely to have multi-generational families. So we were able to roughly recreate the asymmetries we saw in the population just on socioeconomic status and not on their ethnicity. Finally, this is our circuit breaker plot. So you'll remember around about coming into the autumn of 2020, it looked pretty bad, and government was talking about running 2-week circuit breakers. And we looked at that and we thought, I don't think that's going to work. Nothing in our dynamics suggests that's going to work. I put the team onto it. I asked them to model a 2-week lockdown at different points. We were about Thursday evening when I started asking them to model it. And they modeled what would happen if you went into a 2-week lockdown on Monday, and then the following Thursday, etc., etc. And this is what we got. And basically, the take-home message of that is the circuit breakers were never going to work. Even if you put a 4-week circuit breaker and it wasn't going to work. And it wasn't just us who were saying this. SPI-M was saying this too. Everyone was saying this. And we had predicted what we were going to see. At this time, and the modelling date here, I think for us was September the 30th. This is September the 30th we put this model out, where we said, if you don't do something more definitive than a circuit breaker lockdown, you're going to see a peak centred on January that is significantly larger than the original peak, which is exactly what we saw. So I do find that very difficult to understand how nobody was able to bite down on that piece of information. Doesn't matter. You've got to take the hit, and so then you have to understand capacity, and this is where it's relevant to you and your trauma systems, and this is kind of why I got involved in this work anyway. Throughout the pandemic, and in many healthcare systems, we tend to think of capacity the way we think of fuel in the tank of your car. Your car runs well with a full tank of fuel. It runs exactly the same if it's half empty, and exactly the same if it's on the reserve tank at the bottom. As long as you've got something in there, the whole thing still works. You'll remember the charts that show the number of beds that we have left, and the whole language is exactly the same. It's petrol in the tank. If we've got 50% capacity left, the whole system runs. But that's not true. It is not a linear function. Capacity in a healthcare system, which is itself a complex system, is non-linear. And I think I gave this lecture here a few years ago where I talked about surge capacity in major incidents. We make the same mistake in major incidents. This, of course, is Asher Hirschberg's work that shows the quality of care as an arbitrary sort of scale against the critical casualty load per hour coming into a healthcare system. And his insight with a very rudimentary mathematical model was that the number of patients you can receive in an ordinary hospital per unit time before that hospital falls over is low single figures. And it doesn't sound, you know, it's not an alien concept to you now, but in 2005 when I was looking at this, that wasn't well understood in most of the emergency systems that we had. Most people said, we'll make do somehow. And that's the problem. That's how we operate. We'll make do somehow. And that is a statement that says we've got infinite capacity, which we clearly don't. The problem and the dangerous thing about a curve like this, and you can shift this curve, it's like any sigmoidal curve, you can shift it right and left. You can deploy a major incident plan and it shifts it to the right, but that usually gets you to low double figures, okay? And the problem is that if you don't see the shoulder of that curve, you're then in the phase 2 of this, which is a decompensated state, in which the quality of care is plummeting at an accelerating rate, and there's nothing you can do about it until it gets so bad, you get to that second plateau, which is, well, it's so bad it can't get any worse. That is how the care in an overwhelmed healthcare system goes, and you shouldn't be surprised because that is how any complex system fails. Why does it fail like that? Well, because, again, the story of COVID is the story of nested complex systems. It's you as a complex healthcare system dealing with COVID as a complex threat within a population that's moving in a complex way and spreading the virus in a complex way. The healthcare system is built in a hub and spoke model. We deliberately built it that way. It's not a bad way to build it. So in that hub and spoke model, you've got nodes that are usually the big teaching hospitals that have many connections, and you have DGHs that have very few connections, 1 or 2 connections, right? This is exactly what our networks are like. Now this is the mathematical description of what a hospital network looks like. The black dots in the middle are like your big tertiary centres, the white dots are your DGHs. So only a few nodes have many connections, most nodes have very few connections. Now, this is a great way to build a network if you want it to be resilient against a random attack. And by random attack, really this is what we experience every day. If one of the DGHs in your patch is having a hard time, all the other DGHs can operate because they remain connected to one another and to the tertiary centres. And you can take out quite a few nodes, and this is what we saw during COVID. Our most vulnerable DGHs with the hardest demographics around them go down early. But the network stands up and can bail you out. This is how we responded. The problem is that this type of network is very vulnerable to a deliberate attack on the targeted key node. And although it wasn't deliberate, we'll all remember that the DGHs go down first. They send their patient load downhill to the tertiary centre. The tertiary centre then takes the hit off not 1, but 2 or 3 centres that are folding, and that folds the node. And if you can see what happens now, the connectivity when you take that node out becomes this. So you take the whole node out, and that node now can't do anything. And that's exactly what we saw in Jan-Feb 2021. You'll remember we were moving people around the whole country. We moved people from the southeast up to Newcastle. I remember we used to get on the calls in the morning in the southeast when we were in trouble there, looking to move patients from Margate, and would phone the southwest team, and southwest would say, we've got nothing. I mean, there's a bed and Torbay if you want it, and we're like, we'll have that. And that is exactly because of this. We had entire networks going down because this hub and spoke network became vulnerable because we lost the key nodes from those networks all over the country. This is what you get. That is why you get the shape of that curve. The problem is, of course, then, we're managing it as if that curve doesn't exist. We're managing it like it's still a petrol tank. This is the Daily Mail telling you there's still capacity in the system. What's the problem? We should just open everything up. And it's not their fault, actually. It's our fault for not engaging properly and for not recognising that we need to explain this more properly to these people. The reason I show this is because at this point, I was very lucky. I shared an office at Skipton House with the military, and particularly with the Royal Logistics Corps. And they were very, very helpful. You know, whenever you watch the disaster movie on Hollywood and the military turn up, basically everything goes wrong after that. But actually it was the opposite during COVID. They were really useful in mentoring me through this entire process. There was an amusing moment where one of the guys in our office was Major Dave from Royal Logistics Corps, and we were having trouble distributing some PPE. And I remember going up to him going, Dave, I hope you've got some good solutions for us because we're in real trouble. And he said, Kev, there are no good solutions left. That's why they've called us. Slightly sobering moment. So I asked these guys, and although war was an overused metaphor, it's more warlike than anything else. I asked these guys, you know, how do you do it? So this slide is a picture of Restrepo, which is a forward operating base in the Korangal during the Afghan War, Americans, US 173rd Airborne. And it was one of the most hotly contested of all the forward operating bases. And I said, how, if you're managing this from HMS Warrior in Northwood, do you command a FOB or know what's going on in a FOB in the Korangal, you know, the equivalent British FOB? And they said, oh, yeah, because I said, I know that you don't do what we're doing at the moment, which is count rifles, count soldiers, count sandbags, count ration packs. I said, no, if we want to know what's going on, we send a fairly senior detachment down there of the security detail, and he or she talks to the lieutenant in command, and he or she looks around, thinks about what they took last week, thinks about what they're going to take tomorrow, looks at how many rifles they've got, how many rounds of ammunition, how many ration packs, and then makes a complex assessment of that complex system and says, I think we've got about a week here. You can't do it just by counting stuff. You've got to go and get what the military call the atmospherics. And that is what we were missing. And so with that in mind, I put together teams that went out and visited 50 of the hardest hit units in the country. And so, you know, in the middle of the pandemic, well, the weirdest thing that I think I did was I just went on a road trip with a few selected people and to get in there and do exactly what the military did. Because I knew that what was appearing on the dashboard wasn't what I was hearing down the phone from these people. And when you got there, it was a very different story. These, I think for me, were some of the hardest visits I've ever done anywhere at any time. A good day was when only the people I was talking to were crying by the end. These were really hard-hit hospitals, and you know, I don't need to tell you as people in the room, but to other non-medical audiences, it's important, I think, that we continue to explain to people that this wasn't easy, and it was hard for everybody. The worst thing about this to me was we went into these places and we had three types of team. We had the rapid response, rapid review teams who would go to find out what was going on because you heard someone was in trouble. We had the rapid support teams where we'd go in and provide immediate support for the hospitals that were about to fall over. And we had the peer support teams where we'd take some intensivists from one unit and visit another unit of similarly sized unit with other intensivists, just so they could reflect upon their joint experiences. And we weren't sure how it was going to go, but at the end of it, so many of them, at the end of the day, said three things that really haunt me. One, they said, thank you for coming. And it wasn't our intent to be thanked for coming. Thank you for coming. We thought we were alone, we thought we were doing it wrong. And I heard that at most of the units we went to. And that signifies a failure of leadership way up the chain. If units are saying that to you, it means you are failing fundamentally. If it takes an amateur like me to walk in to tell people you're not alone, you haven't been doing it wrong, then you know, that is not a good global leadership piece. We coupled the peer support visits with something more objective. So in the end, you can't put boots on the ground in every unit in the hospital. And so the best surrogate was to look at the well-being of the staff. And the reason is because the strategic approach to this crisis was simply to look at the gap between demand for healthcare and the supply of human resource and smear the staff sequentially into that gap. It's what we always do in the NHS. It's not very clever, but it is very easy to do. And the problem about that strategy is if you're not measuring the thing that you're using to cope, which is your workforce, then you will never see the bottom of that. So we ran surveys across the intensive care units. Now, it's not because intensive care was more important, it's just to run a survey like this, you need to have quite good engagement with these teams on the ground to get good participation rates. We got good participation rates. We ran it, I think, 9 times. At the peak of this, we got about 3,000 respondents in a single round from about 43 units. I won't go through all of those figures with you. Suffice to say that those are screamingly high figures for anxiety, depression, harmful use of alcohol, and suicidal ideation. The PCL6 score we used, which is a measure of probable post-traumatic stress reported, up until we did this survey, the highest published figure using a similar measure anywhere in the literature was from Steve Legg et al., which surveyed British military veterans deployed in a combat role in Afghanistan, and their probable post-traumatic stress rate was 17%. Our workforce, on average, was running at 46.5 at the peak. They never recovered lower than 28%. I think if you survey them now, they'd be about 25, 24%. So we definitely did this at great cost. And that's a really, really important message for us to go forwards with. Okay. In the end, when you do all of this stuff and you try and look at the abstract description of how we dealt with this pandemic, I begin to have sympathy for my orthopedic colleagues, because you know those guys at heart, they know what an osteoclast is, they know what an osteoblast is, they know about osteocytes, they know there's a lacuno-canalicular network, and they know there's intracellular signaling mechanisms. But in the end, they just want to find the bone and hit it with a hammer. And that's really what you want to know. If you are the victim of a complex system like this, what is your coping strategy? Now, this is basically what I've learned from touring all of the systems I've been through. I've been through NASA, now senior pre-hospital systems, obviously now healthcare systems. I even went to see the Toyota production line in Kentucky, which is the biggest Toyota production line in the country. I was very kindly hosted by the military in Afghanistan in 2014 when I went out there to look at the medical system there. And there's some common themes. The way you adapt to fast evolving threat is this, and this photograph here is my favourite of all of human spaceflight. Forget standing on the moon, forget everything else, this is it. This is the splashdown of the Apollo 13 crew. Jack Swigert is front right in that. In the back there is Jim Lovell, commander of Apollo 13. I've interviewed him, and when I say I've interviewed him, I wanted to understand how they did this thing. I spent 3 days. He was good enough to give us 3 days on separate days. We sat in a library somewhere outside Chicago, just talking to him about how it all happened, and then we went away and we interviewed the extended flight control team. In the blur there is Fred Hayes, who I've also interviewed. So 2 of his 3 crew I've interviewed at length, and their flight control team. The first thing is, of course, as we all know, it's a team sport. Like us in pre-hospital systems and lead-in trauma teams, we are simply the most visible element of a much wider and much more complex system. That's how we work. There is a heroic narrative, that narrative is wrong. We are hostage to the complexity of the system that stands underneath us, and we are interfaced within that. The Apollo 13 crew, for those of you who don't know the story, is a vehicle that was 200,000 miles from Earth, travelling away from the Earth when it experienced an explosion that took out its propulsion, its source of power, its guidance system, and in fact its entire vehicle. And at that point they are dead. That crew died. And when I recently was interviewing one of the NASA engineers, he said NASA have had 4 fatal accidents. They had the Apollo 1 fire, which killed 3, Challenger and Columbia. But Apollo 13 was a fatal accident, it's just nobody died. And so after this thing blew up, they were all going to die that day, and the flight control team solved the problem in front of them, and then defer that death to the next day. Only everyone's going to die tomorrow, and then they get to the next day, and they solve those problems, and they defer it to the next day, and the next day, and the next day, until 8 days later they're splashing down in the Atlantic Ocean alive. And it is a miracle. I mean, it's amazing even when you understand how it happened that they were able to do that. You're dependent upon your flight control team. Now, here's the thing. That flight control team, you absolutely defer expertise and you delegate authority to them. The average age of the flight controller during Apollo was 26 years old. The first thing you should notice there is that in the 1970s, the 26-year-old looked very different. I've interviewed all 3 of these guys at length. It's impressive. So they said, look, yeah, we were very young. We were out of college, but we knew the problem, we knew what was at stake, and we just dealt with it. And the flight director said it's not like they didn't understand risk, they just weren't afraid of it in the same way that we were. I would say in medicine we've slightly infantilized our junior too. This is how you do it, and then I think I'm finished, and if there's time for any questions I'll take. You've got to be comfortable with making decisions in the face of uncertainty. Now, no one in this room has any problem with that. That's what we do day in, day out. What I realised was that in most other walks of life, people are really uncomfortable with that. You say this is a big decision upon which someone's life depends, and the first thing they'll do is ask for more information, and keep asking for more information, and that puts you into a big loop of time. You need to make that decision in the face of uncertainty, sometimes in the face of frank ambiguity, and then you need to commit to that decision. You can't commit lightly to it, you need to fully commit to it, and then you need to go out and delegate authority and defer to expertise. Because it doesn't matter if you're the best doctor in town, there aren't enough of you at a scale crisis like this, so you need to find ways to force multiply, and that is by allowing other people to be everything they can be in that moment. And that's something that in the NHS I don't think we do. We were able to do it during the pandemic, we haven't since. And then you've got to innovate and transform your system. Why? Because you're in crisis, and by definition, your system is not fit for purpose at that moment. That's why you need to innovate, that's why you need to transform. And then you need to fail, and this is the hard bit to understand. The only thing that makes decisions in the face of uncertainty okay is if you are willing to fail on the back of it and go again. And that's what that last effort, iteration. And this actually is what we do on the average pre-hospital job or in the average trauma call or whatever. Fast-moving, uncertain, you go all the way through, you delegate authority and defer expertise because we need more effort than you can give alone, and then you fail and you go again, you keep going again. And that's how we did COVID at national scale across 1.4 million people. We delegated authority to the frontline teams, we got out of their way, and we failed and we went again. And every day we were wrong, but every day we were less wrong, until one day we were almost right, and that was good enough. Thank you very much.
Thanks, absolutely brilliant, powerful, lot to think about. Thank you again. There's a number of questions, but I'm going to just take sort of two combined because I think they're probably most relevant to us now. Somebody's made a comment about that we are probably in a situation now where we're already on that descending slope, and so a link to that. Are there any models for this coming winter crisis, or the one we're already in? So are they doing modelling for this now?
Yeah. So it's really interesting because having sort of talked about that decompensation curve before, I used to lecture that I've never seen a major incident in this country where we've been in phase 2 of that. We always are within coping capacity because of the way we're built as a network, and most of the major incidents we have here don't actually breach out of that plateau. I think during COVID we were in this decompensated steep part of that graph for most of it. I think we continue to be. I'm minded of the response that the Royal Logistics Corps officer gave me when I asked him about the solution to PPE, actually. There are no good solutions now. That's why I still have a job at NHS England. And it's going to be tough to dig our way out of this one, I think. We are in a decompensated state, and I think that the best way to get out of that is, the way you would do it if you were NASA is you de-scope, and I'm also writing a paper about this. I have written a paper and sent it up, but I'm not published it as well. And what you do is you see the gap between supply and demand, and what you do is realise you can never breach it. And so what you then have to do is reduce the scope of your activity so that you can actually allow your team to recover. So what you say is we're not going to try and make a vehicle that's that fast or last that long or it's going to be that light, and then we can recover the crew and then hopefully get back to normal operations sooner. That's what we need to do, but it's politically suicide, so they won't do it.
Thanks, Kevin. On that note, it's a pleasure now to invite Ben to Baskett to come up and give you a little award.
Thank you, sir.